On the coldest morning Grey Fork had seen that year, Ruth Bellamy came out of Price's Mercantile holding an empty flour sack. That sack weighed nothing, but every soul on the boardwalk knew exactly what it meant. It meant Gideon Price had cut her off. It meant the account her dead husband left behind was finished. It meant her 8-year-old boy, Caleb, had gone to sleep hungry the night before, and would wake hungry again unless Ruth found a miracle before sundown. She did not cry in front of the store. Ruth had learned over 2 winters of widowhood that tears were a kind of currency poor women could not afford to spend in public. So she folded the empty sack once, then twice, then tucked it beneath her arm like it was a parcel worth protecting, and she started toward the street. Grey Fork moved around her without touching her. A wagon creaked past with flour barrels in the back. 2 women in fur-lined capes stepped around a patch of dirty snow. A deputy warmed his hands outside the jail and looked at Ruth for half a second before pretending he hadn't. That was the mercy of a western town. It rarely laughed at you. It simply trained itself not to see you. Ruth had made it to the edge of the boardwalk when she felt the stare. Not the quick glance of gossip. Not pity. Something steadier. She turned. Across the street, beside the telegraph office, a man stood with one gloved hand resting on the saddle horn of a dark bay horse. Silas Vale. Even people who had never spoken to him knew his name. He owned the Iron Gate Ranch, 40 square miles of cattle, hay flats, timber rights, spring water, and enough hired men to turn an opinion into a law if he wished it. Bankers lowered their voices around him. The sheriff took off his hat when he passed, and every widow in Grey Fork had heard some version of the same warning, and that rich did not notice a poor woman unless the noticing cost her something. Ruth turned away. Mrs. Bellamy. She stopped, but she did not face him. "I'm not asking for anything," she said. "I didn't say you were. Then there's no business between us." Silas came around to where she could see him. He was not as polished as the stories made him sound. His coat was expensive, but the hem was stained with mud. His jaw was rough with 2 days of beard. His eyes were pale brown, almost gold in the winter light, and they looked tired in a way money did not fix. His gaze dropped to the folded flour sack. "Walked 4 miles for that?" Ruth felt heat rise under her collar. "For air," she said. "Town air is famous for improving a person." The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile. "Must be powerful air," Silas said. "It emptied your sack." Ruth's hand tightened around the cloth. "Mr. Vale, I know what a man sounds like when he's about to offer charity." "Do you?" "Yes." "Then you'll know that isn't what this is." He reached into his coat and took out a small leather notebook. Not money, a notebook. He opened it, turned a few pages, and showed her a line written in a strong, squared hand. "Bellamy, Thomas. 2 days wagon repair. Outstanding." Ruth stared at the words. It struck her like a hand to the chest. "That's my husband." "I know. Thomas died owing half this county." "Not to me." Silas closed the notebook. "He fixed 2 axles for my freight wagon 3 summers ago. Wouldn't take cash that day. Said I could settle it when winter made him regret being proud." Ruth swallowed. "My husband said a great many foolish things." "He said a few useful ones, too." Silas nodded toward Price's Mercantile. "I owe the Bellamy house for 2 days' work. Flour, beans, coffee, salt pork. Maybe a little sugar, if Price remembers how to be human." Ruth stepped back. No. Silas studied her. No. No. Account. By supper, the whole town will say I stood outside until the richest rancher in the territory took pity on me. Would they be wrong? Yes, Ruth snapped. Because I didn't stand outside for pity. I stood there because I was trying to decide whether pride can be boiled into soup. The words came out sharper than she intended. A few people looked over. Ruth could feel her face burning. Silas did not look away. And can it? Ruth hated him for asking gently. She hated herself more for wanting to answer. No, she said. For the first time, Silas looked toward the road that led south out of town, toward the poor homesteads, the bad creek beds, the cabins that smoked too thin in winter. You have a boy. Ruth's voice dropped. Leave my son out of this. I will, if you can. That landed. Ruth looked at him then, truly looked at him, and saw no smirk, no hunger, no easy arrogance. Only a man standing in the cold with one hand in his pocket and the other open at his side, as if he knew a frightened animal would bolt if he moved too fast. I won't be bought, she said. I'm not buying. Then what are you doing? Silas glanced once more at the empty sack. Then he said the first thing that made Ruth afraid of him. Trying not to walk past a thing I'll hate myself for remembering. That should have ended it. Ruth should have turned away, but the wind cut through her shawl, and the road home was long, and Caleb was waiting in a cabin where the last handful of cornmeal had already been scraped from the tin. So Ruth lifted her chin. 1 sack, she said. Silas nodded once. 1. And you will not speak to me inside that store like I belong to you. The almost smile returned, softer this time. Mrs. Inside that store like I belong to you. The almost smile returned, softer this time. Mrs. Bellamy, from what little I've seen, you don't belong to anyone. That was how Ruth Bellamy walked back into Price's Mercantile, beside the most powerful rancher in Gray Fork, carrying an empty flour sack that suddenly felt heavier than a mortgage. And by the time she came out again, the sack was full. Flour at the bottom, coffee wrapped in brown paper, beans, salt, a small twist of sugar Ruth had not asked for, and 1 red apple, which Silas had placed on the counter without a word. Ruth saw it. So did Gideon Price. So did half the town. But when she reached to take it out of the sack, Silas stopped her with a look. Part of the debt, he said. Ruth wanted to argue. Then she pictured Caleb's face. She left the apple where it was. The road south ran white and hard beneath her boots. Silas did not offer her a ride. She would have refused, and somehow he knew enough not to ask. Instead, he walked his horse beside her for the first quarter mile, far enough for town eyes to lose interest, not far enough to make the kindness dangerous. At the bend near the frozen wash, Ruth stopped. You can go back now. Silas looked over the fields, the brittle grass, the clouds stacking low against the mountains. That cabin of yours got a good stove? Ruth's stomach tightened. It has a stove. That wasn't the question. It burns. So does a brush pile. Doesn't mean it'll keep a boy alive in February. Ruth faced him. I said you could go back. Silas took the warning for what it was. He tipped his hat, mounted the bay, and gathered the reins. Then he looked down at the sack in her arms. Mrs. Bellamy. What? When your husband fixed my wagon, he told me he had a son who could carve a horse out of kindling and make it look alive. Despite herself, Ruth's throat caught. Caleb still carves. Good. Why? Because a boy who can make life out of scrap wood shouldn't have to grow up thinking hunger is normal. Before Ruth could answer, Silas turned the horse and rode back toward town. Ruth stood there long after he was gone. Then she walked home with the flour sack pressed to her chest, like she was carrying proof of something she did not yet understand. Caleb met her at the door. His coat was too small, one sleeve patched at the elbow, his dark hair flattened from sleep. He tried not to look at the sack first, but he was 8 years old, and hunger had made him honest. "Mama?" Ruth held up the apple. Caleb's eyes went wide. For one bright second, all the cold in the cabin disappeared. "Where'd you get that?" "Old debt," Ruth said. Caleb took the apple with both hands. "Can I eat all of it?" The question broke something in her. Ruth knelt in front of him and brushed his hair back. "You can eat every bit except the stem." He laughed, and the sound filled the one-room cabin like a church bell. While Caleb ate, Ruth made bread thinner than she wanted and stew weaker than she admitted. But there was food, real food, enough for that night and the next. After supper, Caleb sat by the stove with a piece of pine in his hand, shaving curls onto the floor. Ruth watched his little knife move. Patient. Too serious for a child. "What are you making?" "A horse. You've made 6 horses. This one's better." "Why?" Caleb paused. "Because it's for Mr. Vale." Ruth's hands stilled in the dishwater. "You know Mr. Vale?" "I saw him from the window. He rode behind you for a little." "He did not ride behind me. He rode beside the road." Caleb grinned without looking up. "That's behind you if I'm inside." Ruth almost smiled. "Almost. He doesn't need a wooden horse. Maybe rich men need things that don't cost money." The knife scraped. The stove popped. Ruth looked toward the window where frost had feathered the glass. "Maybe they do." Silas came 3 days later, not with a wagon of charity, not with a speech. He came at mid-morning with a cracked leather harness over one shoulder and a question in his mouth. "Mrs. Bellamy, do you still have your husband's awl?" Ruth stood in the doorway, wary. "Yes." "Then I have work that needs doing." Her eyes narrowed. "You brought harness all the way from Irongate because none of your men can sew leather?" They can sew it ugly. Need it done right. That sounds convenient." "It is," Silas said, "for both of us." Ruth should have shut the door. Instead, she took the harness. The leather was truly split, the stitching was truly bad, and the pay Silas offered was neither insulting nor excessive, which made refusing him harder. So Ruth sat at the table and worked the awl through leather, while Caleb hovered near Silas with the shy desperation of a boy who had not spoken to a kind man in months. By noon, Caleb had shown him 3 wooden horses, 1 crooked cow, and a carved pistol Ruth had not known existed. Silas examined each with grave attention. "This cow looks offended," he said. "It's a bull," Caleb said. "Mistake. That explains the attitude." Caleb laughed so hard he dropped the pistol. Ruth looked down at the harness so neither of them would see her face. After that, Silas came once a week, always with a reason. A bridle that needed mending, a sack of oats he claimed had been ordered twice, a stovepipe he had no use for but thought might fit that chimney. Ruth fought every kindness like it was a wolf at the door. Silas never pushed through. He simply stood on the porch and let her decide whether to open it. And each time, against her better judgment, Ruth did. By late November, Caleb waited for the sound of Silas's bay before Ruth admitted she was listening for it too. One evening, snow began before sundown, small, hard flakes ticking against the window. Silas was kneeling beside the stove, fitting a new iron latch onto the door while Caleb held the lantern. Ruth stood at the table, rolling dough. "You own half the grass north of Gray Fork," she said. "Do you fix every widow's stove yourself?" Silas tightened a screw. "No." "Then why this one?" Caleb looked up. Ruth wished he had not. Silas took his time answering. "Because this one is in front of me." "That is not an answer." "It's the one I have." He stood, wiped his hands on a rag, and looked around the cabin. The sagging shelf, the quilt nailed over the wall crack, the bucket under the roof leak. Then his eyes came back to Ruth. I know what it is to live inside a place everybody else has already written off. Ruth's defense faltered. You? Silas gave a humorless laugh. My father left me debt, 400 head of cattle, and a ranch every banker in 3 counties expected to watch fail. I spent 10 years proving them wrong. And did it make you happy? No. The word was so plain, Ruth had no reply. Silas looked at the stove. It made me rich. That's not the same thing. Caleb, with the brutal honesty of childhood, asked, Then why keep doing it? Silas smiled faintly. Habit, I suppose. Caleb frowned. That's a bad reason. Yes, Silas said. It is. That night, after Silas rode away, Ruth lay awake listening to the wind worry the roof. She told herself he was dangerous because he had money, but that was no longer the whole truth. Silas Vale was dangerous because he noticed. He noticed the crack in the stove door, the patched elbow on Caleb's coat, the way Ruth counted beans before adding them to the pot. And worst of all, he noticed the things Ruth had trained herself to hide. Fear, loneliness, want. Not the wanting of a desperate woman looking for rescue, the deeper wanting, to set a second cup on the table without shame, to hear a man's boots on the porch and feel relief instead of dread. Brave every waking minute of the day. The blizzard came 2 weeks before Christmas. It began before dawn, with a sound like a freight train moving through the pines. By sunrise, the whole world beyond the window had disappeared. Ruth fed the stove, broke ice from the water bucket, and told Caleb the storm would pass. By noon, the stove began to smoke. By mid-afternoon, the iron seam along the back had split. Ruth stuffed rags along the gap, then clay, then ash mixed with water. But the crack widened each time the fire caught. Smoke curled into the room. Caleb coughed. Ruth opened the door for air, and the storm slammed snow across the floor. No, she whispered. She tried again, and again. By evening, the cabin was colder than the shed. Caleb sat wrapped in 2 quilts, his face pale, his lips almost blue. Mama, I'm all right. He was lying. Ruth knew it. She looked at the stove, then at the door, then at the white violence outside. Iron Gate was 6 miles away by road, maybe 4 across the flats, if a person knew where the dry creek turned. Ruth knew the flats. Thomas had shown her once, back when life still contained foolish confidence. She could stay and pray the cracked stove held, or she could move, still contained foolish confidence. She could stay and pray the cracked stove held, or she could move. Pride argues loudest right before it becomes deadly. Ruth wrapped Caleb in every blanket she owned, tied a scarf around his mouth, and hitched the old mule to the sled Thomas had built for hauling firewood. The mule fought the first 100 yards. Then the wind hit open ground. Snow erased the trail. Ruth leaned into the rope beside the mule, one hand gripping the sled, the other shielding her eyes. She could not see the mountains. She could not see the fence line. She could only hear Caleb coughing behind her. Once she fell to her knees. Once she lost a glove and could not find it. Once she thought she heard her dead husband's voice say her name, and that frightened her more than the cold. Then a lantern appeared in the storm, not ahead, to her left, moving. Ruth tried to shout, but the wind took the sound. The lantern grew larger. A horse snorted. A man's voice cut through the white. Ruth! She did not remember falling. She remembered strong arms lifting her. She remembered Silas's coat smelling of snow, leather, and smoke. She remembered trying to say Caleb's name and failing. Then Silas was at the sled, pulling the blankets back. Caleb. Caleb's eyes fluttered. Silas turned to someone behind him. Get the boy on my horse, now. There were 2 ranch hands with him, faces wrapped in scarves, horses stamping in the drift. Ruth grabbed Silas's sleeve. I was coming to you. I know. The stove. I know. I waited too long. Silas looked at her then, and the fear in his face was so raw it burned worse than the wind. Then stop talking and live long enough to regret it indoors. Iron Gate rose out of the blizzard like a ship from fog. Its windows burned gold. Its chimneys poured smoke. Ruth had never seen a house look like mercy before. Mrs. Silas's housekeeper took one look at Caleb and began giving orders before Silas could. Guest room, hot bricks, dry blankets. Not near the big hearth yet, he'll shock. Lena, water. Tom, fetch Dr. Harrow if you have to drag him by his collar. Ruth stood in the entry, shaking so hard she could not unfasten her own coat. Silas did it for her. His hands were careful at the buttons. Too careful. When the coat came free, Ruth looked down and saw that her left hand was bleeding where the rope had burned through the skin. Silas saw it too. His jaw tightened. Sit. I need Caleb. He is being cared for. I need him. Silas took her by the shoulders. Not hard. Enough. Ruth. He loses you too. That stopped her. She sat. Mrs. Ansell wrapped her hand. Someone brought coffee. Someone else brought a basin of warm water. Ruth could hear Caleb coughing upstairs. Every cough drove a nail into her. Later, after Dr. Harrow arrived and declared Caleb chilled but not frozen, feverish but not lost, Ruth sat beside the guest room bed while her boy slept under 3 quilts with a hot brick wrapped near his feet. Silas stood by the window. Outside, the storm raged against the glass. Inside, everything was warm enough to make Ruth ashamed. You saved us, she said. Silas did not turn around. You found the lantern. That isn't the same thing. It's close enough. Ruth looked at Caleb. I should have come sooner. Yes. She flinched. Silas turned then. I won't lie to make you feel better. I know. You could have died out there. I know. He could have died. Her voice cracked. I know. Silas crossed the room, then stopped before he reached her. The distance mattered. It let the anger remain love's cousin instead of becoming cruelty. I can fight weather. I can fight broken stoves. I can fight men who think a widow is easy prey. But I cannot fight you if you keep mistaking loneliness for strength. Ruth closed her eyes. The truth of it hurt. 4 days. 4 days inside Iron Gate. 4 days of hot meals, dry wool, clean sheets, and the terrible luxury of not carrying the whole world alone. Caleb recovered faster than Ruth did. By the 2nd day, he was sitting up in bed asking Silas how many calves could be born in one night. By the 3rd, he was downstairs near the fire, carving a horse from a piece of cedar Silas had found in the tack room. By the 4th, he was following Silas to the stable, with Mrs. Ansell's permission and Ruth's anxious eyes. Silas changed around Caleb, not softened exactly, revealed. The hard rancher everyone feared became patient when a boy asked how to curry a horse. He explained reins and cinches like they were sacred machinery. He let Caleb fail without laughing. He corrected him without making him small. Ruth watched from the stable door, wrapped in a borrowed shawl, and felt something inside her lean toward them. That frightened her more than the blizzard. That night, after Caleb slept, Ruth found Silas in his study. The room was lined with ledgers and maps. A fire burned low. On the desk lay the little leather notebook with Thomas Bellamy's old debt crossed out. Silas looked up. You should be resting. I'm tired of resting. Fair. Ruth stepped inside. This house is too quiet for its size. Silas leaned back. Yes. Does that bother you? Every night. She had not expected honesty. She had not expected honesty. It loosened something. You could have married. I could have. Why didn't you? He looked toward the fire. Because after I made money, I never knew whether a woman was reaching for my hand or my deed box. Ruth smiled sadly. And before you made money? Before that, I was too busy trying not to lose everything. So you built a kingdom no one lives in. Silas looked at her then. That is exactly what I did. The silence opened between them, dangerous, warm. Ruth should have stepped back. Instead, she said, I don't want your kingdom. I know. You don't know that. I do. Freeze beside your own stove, then sit warm beside mine. That is not admirable. No, Silas said, but it is true. Ruth turned to leave because if she stayed one more minute, she would ask a question that could not be unasked. His voice stopped her at the door. Ruth. She did not turn. What? When this storm ends, I do not want you going back to that cabin because you think you owe suffering loyalty. Her throat tightened. And what do you want? Silas answered quietly. I want you and Caleb safe. That sounds simple. It isn't. No, she said. It isn't. The next morning, the storm broke, came out cruel and bright, shining over drifts as high as fence rails. Silas took 2 men to Ruth's cabin. When they returned, his face told her everything before he spoke. The roof over the lean-to is down. Stove split clean across the back. Chimney pipe is cracked. Main room is standing, but it is not fit for Caleb. Not yet. Ruth held herself very still. How long? To make it safe? A week, maybe 2, if we can get a stove from Cheyenne. I can stay with Mrs. Dalton in town. Mrs. Dalton has 6 children and a room above a stable. It would be proper. Silas's eyes sharpened. Proper nearly killed you. Ruth stepped closer. Do not make me sound foolish because I care what people think. I'm making you sound alive because I want you to stay that way. People already watched me take food from your hand. They watched me settle a debt. They will not see it that way. Then let them be wrong. Ruth laughed once, bitterly. Only a rich man says that like it costs nothing. Silas absorbed it. He deserved some of it. Maybe not all. No, he said. A lonely man says it because he knows public opinion does not keep a bed warm or a child breathing. Ruth looked away first. She stayed. Not because she surrendered. Because Caleb needed warmth, and because the truth had finally become heavier than pride. 10 days, Iron Gate became a place Ruth both loved and feared. Mrs. Ansell taught Caleb to make biscuits. Silas put him on a gentle mare and walked beside him as if the boy were made of glass and gold. Ruth mended linen, helped with accounts, learned which ranch hands lied about feed totals and which ones simply counted badly. Every useful hour made her less like a guest. Every kind evening made leaving harder. Then Asa Morley came. He arrived in a black coat with a fox fur collar, smiling as if the smile had been cut into his face with a knife. Asa had speculated in land for years. He bought debt, he bought rumors, hired men's signatures for cash, and sold them back to wealthier men for twice the price. Ruth had seen him twice before, once near the land office, once talking to Gideon Price. Neither memory pleased her. Mrs. Ansell showed him into Silas's study, where Ruth was adding columns in a ledger. Asa's eyes flicked from her borrowed dress to the papers in front of her. Well, he said, Gray Fork does enjoy a surprise. Silas did not rise from behind the desk. State your business. Asa placed a folded document on the desk. It concerns Mrs. Bellamy's south parcel. Ruth stood. My land? Land is such an emotional word, Asa said. The office prefers claim. Silas's face hardened. Ruth reached for the paper. It was a notice. Her homestead claim had been challenged. Boundary failure. Unpaid improvement assessment. Questionable occupancy. 3 phrases that meant nothing by themselves and everything together. If the office accepts this, Asa said, the parcel reopens for purchase. Ruth's mouth went dry. My husband filed those improvements. Did he? Yes. Then I'm sure the papers will appear. Silas's voice went cold. Who filed the challenge? Asa smiled. A concerned party. You. A concerned party, he repeated. Ruth read the notice again. There was a hearing date, 2 days away. That is not enough time. It is the time allowed. Silas stood then. The room changed with him. Asa. The smile faded just a little. Careful, Vale. This is government procedure, not a cattle dispute. And you are trespassing in my house. I came as a courtesy. You came to frighten a woman while her son recovers from fever. Asa looked at Ruth. Mrs. Bellamy does not strike me as easily frightened. Ruth lifted the paper. What do you want? There's no need for unpleasantness. I can purchase the claim from you before the hearing, cash today, enough to start again somewhere less difficult. Ruth stared at him. You want the spring. Asa's eyes sharpened. There it was. The Bellamy parcel was poor in almost every way. Bad soil, mean winter. You want the spring. Asa's eyes sharpened. There it was. The Bellamy parcel was poor in almost every way. Bad soil, mean winter, too much wind. But behind the cabin, under a shelf of red stone, ran the only clean spring south of Gray Fork that did not freeze solid in January. Ruth had never thought of it as wealth. Asa had. You cannot prove that spring is inside your marked boundary, he said. My husband set that line. Your husband is dead. The room went silent. Silas took 1 step forward. Ruth lifted a hand without looking at him. Not because Asa deserved protection, because she needed this fight to remain hers. She folded the notice. Leave. Asa bowed. 2 days, Mrs. Bellamy. Proof or bring a price. When the door closed behind him, Ruth's knees almost failed. Silas moved toward her. She stepped back. No, I haven't said anything. I know what you're going to say. Then let me say it anyway. No. His voice rose. Ruth. No, Silas. You will not buy him off. You will not purchase the land and hand it to me like a wrapped gift. You will not save me in a way that makes every ugly word true. I do not care what Asa Morley says. I do. Why? Because Caleb has to grow up in the world those words make. Silas stopped. Ruth hated that he understood, or maybe she hated that he did not understand enough. She went on, quieter. If you buy that land, I will spend the rest of my life wondering where help ended and ownership began. Silas's expression changed. That hurt him. Good, she thought, then immediately hated herself. I would never own you. You wouldn't mean to. The argument ended there because neither of them had a sentence strong enough to cross the gap. That night, Ruth returned to the Bellamy cabin against Silas's wishes. Caleb was well enough to travel, wrapped in quilts. The stove had been replaced, the roof patched. It was not comfortable, but it was theirs. Silas stood by the wagon, one hand on the rail. This is pride. Ruth lifted Caleb's medicine bag onto the seat. This is proof of occupancy. Damn the occupancy. That is easy to say when no one can challenge yours. He flinched. She saw it. She did not take it back. Caleb looked between them, frightened. That stopped Ruth more than Silas's anger. She softened her voice. I'll come to the hearing. Silas's jaw worked. With what proof? Whatever I can find. And if you find none, then I'll stand there anyway. He looked at her for a long time. Then he untied the wagon himself and stepped back. Send for me if his fever rises. Ruth nodded. She did not trust her voice. The cabin felt smaller after Iron Gate. The repaired stove gave heat, but not confidence. The new roof kept out snow, but not fear. Ruth spent the evening tearing through Thomas's old trunk, reading every receipt, every land office copy, every useless scrap he had saved except the one she needed. Caleb slept badly. By midnight, his cough had deepened. By dawn, his cheeks were red. Ruth told herself it was ordinary. By noon, he was burning. She gave him water, medicine, prayers. She kept the stove roaring until the cabin walls sweated. None of it helped. When Caleb began asking for Silas in a voice barely louder than breath, something inside Ruth finally broke open. Not dramatically, not beautifully. It simply gave way. She hitched the mule and drove through the cold dusk to Iron Gate, with Caleb wrapped in her arms. When the ranch house appeared, Ruth did not care who saw. She did not care what Gray Fork would say. She screamed Silas's name before the wagon stopped. The door flew open. Silas ran. One look at Caleb, and every word from their argument vanished. He lifted the boy. Mrs. Ansell, Dr. Harrow, now! He carried Caleb upstairs. Ruth followed, shaking. This time, Caleb did not have chill. He had pneumonia. The doctor said the word with the careful softness men use when they do not want to say death in front of a mother. 3 days passed in a blur of wet cloths, steam, bitter medicine, and the terrible sound of a child fighting for air. Ruth did not leave the room. Silas did not ask her to. He brought coffee she forgot to drink, food she could not taste, dry cloths, fresh water, a basin, wood for the small fire. He slept in a chair outside the door when Mrs. Ansell forced him from the room. On the third night, Caleb's breathing grew thin. Ruth leaned close. Stay, she whispered. Please, baby, stay. Silas stood behind her, one hand gripping the bedpost so hard his knuckles whitened. Near dawn, the fever broke. Caleb slept. Truly slept. Dr. Harrow came at sunrise and listened to his chest for a long time. Then he nodded. He has turned the corner. Ruth did not weep until the doctor left. Then she folded in half beside the bed and made a sound Silas would remember for the rest of his life. Not relief, not grief, both. When she could stand again, she found Silas in the hall. I was wrong, she said. Silas looked older than he had 3 days ago. So was I. No, you were right about Caleb needing me alive more than he needs land. Yes, but I was right too. He waited. Ruth wiped her face. He also needs to see his mother fight for what belongs to her. Not because dirt is holy, because men like Asa Morley depend on women becoming too tired to stand. Silas nodded slowly. Then we fight. No buying, no buying, no backroom favor, no. What then? Silas looked toward the stairs. We find proof. The proof came from a place neither of them expected. Caleb. On the afternoon before the hearing, while Ruth searched Thomas's trunk for the 5th time, Caleb woke and asked for his coat. You're not going outside. No, the old one. Ruth frowned. The one with the blue patch? He nodded. Pa hid papers in the lining. He said it was safer than the bread tin because nobody steals a coat with holes. Ruth froze. Silas was in the doorway. Moved for a second. Then Ruth ran. The coat was in the bottom of the trunk, small now, smelling faintly of smoke and cedar. Ruth found the inside seam beneath the blue patch. The stitches were not hers. Her hands shook as she cut them open. Inside was folded oilcloth. Inside the oilcloth was a tax receipt, 2 survey notes, and a hand-drawn plat signed by Deputy Surveyor Amos Vale. Ruth looked up. Vale? Silas crossed the room and took the paper carefully. My uncle. The survey notes marked the red stone shelf, the spring, the South Cottonwood. The witness tree burned with a double notch. The Bellamy boundary did not end before the spring. It ran around it. Thomas had not been careless. He had been slow to trust offices, so he had hidden copies where poverty itself would protect them. Ruth pressed the papers to her chest. For the first time since Asa walked through the door, she smiled. Not because the fight was over, because she finally had a weapon that was hers. The hearing took place in the back room of the land office. There were no grand benches, no jury, just a long table, a clerk with ink on his cuff, a stove that smoked, Asa Morley in his black coat, 2 men Ruth recognized as debtors of his, and Silas Vale standing behind Ruth without touching her. Gray Fork had heard enough to gather outside, the town pressing against the windows. Asa presented first. He had confidence. He had witnesses. He had a map copied clean enough to look official. His men swore the Bellamy fence had never enclosed the spring. They swore Thomas had failed to improve the south line. They swore Ruth had abandoned occupancy when she stayed at Iron Gate. Each statement landed like a stone. The clerk looked at Ruth. Mrs. Bellamy, your response? Ruth stood. Her legs shook. Her voice did not. My son nearly died during the storm, she said. I stayed at Iron Gate because the cabin stove split and the roof failed. That is not abandonment. That is survival. The clerk made a note. Sympathy is not evidence. No, Ruth said, it isn't. She placed the tax receipt on the table. This is, then the survey notes, and this, then the plat, and this. Silas leaned forward. Read the signature. The clerk looked over his spectacles. Deputy Surveyor Amos Vale. A murmur rose outside. Asa's smile tightened. My condolences to your uncle's reputation, Vale, but an old sketch does not move a boundary. Silas's voice stayed calm. No, a witness tree does. Ruth unfolded the final note. South Cottonwood, double notch, burned mark facing Redstone. The clerk looked up. That tree still standing? Ruth answered, yes. Asa laughed. Silas turned toward the door. Tom? One of his ranch hands stepped in, carrying a fresh-cut slab of cottonwood as wide as a dinner plate. The bark was charred in 2 old notches. Beneath them, sealed in the wood grain, was the survey mark. The room went quiet. Silas had sent men at dawn, not to bribe, not to threaten, to cut proof from a deadfall limb of the witness tree before Asa's men thought to remove it. The clerk ran his fingers over the burned marks. Asa's face changed. For one beautiful second, the man looked exactly like what he was. Not powerful. Caught. The clerk cleared his throat. Ruth closed her eyes. Outside, the crowd erupted. Not cheering exactly, but buzzing, shifting, reacting to the shape of a story changing in front of them. Asa stood so fast his chair scraped. This is influence. Ruth opened her eyes. No, she said. Then she looked at Silas. then back at Asa. This is evidence. That was the moment Gray Fork stopped seeing Ruth Bellamy as a poor widow under a rich man's coat. They saw the receipts, the survey, the marked cottonwood. They saw Silas standing behind her, not in front. And they saw Asa Morley leave the land office with his black coat buttoned wrong and his face the color of old tallow. He marked cottonwood. They saw Silas standing behind her, not in front, and they saw Asa Morley leave the land office with his black coat buttoned wrong and his face the color of old tallow. The story should have ended there. It did not. Victories have consequences too. For a week, Ruth and Caleb remained at Iron Gate, while Dr. Harrow watched Caleb's lungs. Silas visited the Bellamy cabin daily with workers, not to make it grand, but to make it sound. A proper roof, a reinforced stove wall, new chinking, a door that did not rattle in its frame. Ruth signed every supply order herself. Silas hated that. He respected it anyway. One evening, she found him in the stable, brushing the dark bay horse that had stood outside the telegraph office on the day everything began. Caleb was asleep upstairs. The ranch was quiet. Lantern light moved over Silas's shoulders. Ruth stopped by the stall door. "I owe you an apology." Silas did not turn. "For which fight?" "I'm trying to keep a tidy record." She almost laughed. "For believing help from you had to become a chain." He set down the brush. "I gave you reasons to fear that." "No, men like Asa did. Poverty did. Widowhood did. You just had the bad luck of arriving after all of them." Silas faced her. "I want to marry you." Ruth's breath caught. He said it without flourish, without kneeling, without turning it into theater. "I love you," he said. "I love Caleb. I love the way you fight me when I'm wrong and half the time when I'm right. I love that your first instinct is to stand, even when sitting down would be easier. And I am tired of this house being quiet when you leave." Ruth gripped the stall door. "Silas, I am not asking because of the land. I am not asking because you need a roof. I am asking because when you are not here, every room in this place feels like it is waiting for a voice it already knows." "And if I say no?" "Then I will keep helping with the cabin until it is finished, and I will stay away after if that is what you need." She believed him. That was the terrible part. A chain pulls. Silas had opened his hands. Ruth looked across the stable, at the bridles, the lantern, the horse breathing warm into the cold air. "I don't know how to need someone without feeling ashamed." Silas came closer, then stopped. "Neither do I. You own an empire, and I have been lonely in every acre of it." Ruth's eyes filled. "I'm afraid." "So am I." "Of what?" "Of building a life with you and discovering I don't know how to be gentle enough for it." That broke her more than any grand promise could have, because it was not a man claiming certainty. It was a man telling the truth. Ruth stepped into him. Silas did not move until she touched his coat. He wrapped his arms around her like he had been holding back winter itself. She did not answer that night, not fully. Some choices deserve more than fear's first reaction. But 2 mornings later, Caleb found Silas in the yard, repairing a gate latch, and asked, "If you marry Mama, can I still keep Pa's name?" Silas went still. Ruth stood on the porch, the question cutting through her. Silas crouched in front of Caleb. "Your Pa's name is yours," he said. "No man worth keeping would take it." Caleb studied him. "Could I have yours too?" Silas's face changed. Ruth had seen him face storms, lawyers, cattle thieves, and Asa Morley. She had never seen him look afraid of hope. He said, "I would be honored." Caleb nodded, satisfied. Then he handed Silas a wooden horse. This one was carved better than all the others. Long neck, bent legs, a tail like it had caught wind. "For you," Caleb said, "so you have a horse that stays inside." Silas took it with both hands. "Thank you." Ruth watched from the porch and knew her answer before Silas looked up. They married in the rebuilt Bellamy cabin, not at Iron Gate. Ruth insisted. Silas did not argue. The cabin smelled of fresh pine, wood smoke, and coffee. Mrs. Ansell cried into a handkerchief and denied it. Dr. Harrow signed as witness. The preacher stood near the repaired stove. Caleb held the rings in the same empty flour sack Ruth had carried out of Price's mercantile months earlier. She had washed it, mended the corner, tied it with blue thread. When Silas saw it, his eyes went to hers. The whole story was there. Hunger, pride, help, storm, proof, choice. Ruth took his hand, not because she had nowhere else to go, because she finally understood that love was not the loss of a place to stand. It was someone standing there with you. After the wedding, Ruth kept the Bellamy parcel in her name. Silas added Iron Gate water rights to a joint trust for Caleb, not as a gift, as a covenant. A fork before spring thaw, and found easier widows to frighten elsewhere. Gideon Price discovered a sudden interest in politeness. The town, being a town, talked until a better story came along. But slowly the sharp edges wore down. People saw Silas at the Bellamy cabin, hauling lumber in his shirt sleeves. They saw Ruth at Iron Gate, correcting ledgers no foreman dared question. They saw Caleb riding the gentle mare between two homes, carrying his wooden knife, his old name, and his new one, without shame. By the next winter, the cabin no longer looked like a place surviving by stubbornness alone. It had a tight roof, a sound stove, stacked wood higher than Caleb's shoulder, and a shelf above the hearth where Silas kept the carved cedar horse. On the first cold morning of January, Ruth stood in the doorway with a cup of coffee warming her hands. Snow lay clean over the yard. Caleb and Silas were at the trough, breaking ice with a mallet, arguing over whether a newborn calf should be named Biscuit or General Sherman. Silas looked up and caught Ruth watching. He smiled. Not the public smile Gray Fork feared. The private one she had learned meant he was home before he reached the door. Caleb ran past him toward the cabin, breath steaming. The calf tried to eat Silas's glove. Did he deserve it? Yes. Silas followed slower, shaking his head. That boy has turned the whole ranch against me. Ruth laughed. The sound startled her a little. It still did sometimes. Silas stepped onto the porch. You all right? Ruth looked past him at the land, the spring that had nearly been stolen, the cabin that had nearly failed, the road to town where she had once carried an empty sack and thought shame was heavier than hunger. Then she looked at the man who had not bought her, not rescued her into silence, not stood in front of her when she needed to be seen. He had stood beside her. That had made all the difference. I'm all right, Ruth said. Silas brushed a thumb over her wedding band. Just all right? She leaned into him. Better than all right. I'm home. The wind moved over the snowfields, sharp and bright. Inside the cabin, the stove burned steady. Above it, the wooden horse waited on its shelf, and on a peg by the door hung the old flour sack, mended with blue thread, empty again. But this time, it did not mean hunger. It meant the morning Ruth Bellamy learned that an empty thing could become a beginning. It meant pride did not have to die for love to live. It meant a home was not proved by a deed or saved by money or made warm by walls alone. Home was the hand that stayed open, the storm you no longer had to cross by yourself, and the life you chose when fear finally loosened its grip.